In this video, I'm going to tell you about 5 things that can make your wildlife photography more impactful. This is 5 for Friday. Hey guys, often when people are photographing wildlife, they focus too much on the subject. We all do this, especially when we're seeing a species for the first time. We take lots of shots, and sometimes those shots are really not that great. We get excited because the subject is there, and it's very easy to get overly focused on the subject. But what you end up getting in a lot of cases is photos that are basically just record or evidence or proof shots. So these are photos that show that you saw an animal and you were there. And there's often not much that's interesting about those photos because it's really just the subject that is the only thing that holds interest in the image. And there are a lot of other elements that are really needed in order to make that image more interesting. So in this video, we're going to talk about 5 of those things. The first thing we want to talk about is light. Now, of course, we need light to have any photos at all. But often we are talking about things such as the intensity of the light or the quality of the light, whether it's harsh or whether it's soft. Sometimes we talk about the temperature of the light, especially when we're shooting around golden hour, around blue hour. There's a golden color or blue color to the light. But one of the things we don't really talk a lot about as wildlife photographers, and that we don't often look for, is situations where there is some obvious direction and placement to the light, and where the light is not continuous. When the light is continuous, when the light is everywhere in a scene, it does make it easier to photograph a subject because, especially since we can't pose the subject, and the subject is moving around, it makes it easier when there is light everywhere. But those photos are not as interesting as when the light is broken up. And when we're talking about light, often we're talking about the natural light, which is in most cases the sun. So if the sun is being partially obscured by clouds, for example, then it will be broken up and there will be patches of sunlight. If the light is coming through some trees, for example, if the sun is shining through some trees onto a subject, it will be broken up by the trees. Another way that the light could be broken up is by the subject itself. So if you have a backlit situation where the subject is between you and the sun, and you're shooting into the sun, the body of the subject will be blocking the light, and that will be breaking up the light. So these are all very interesting situations that can provide you with opportunities to make your images more impactful. Another way to think about this is to think about what you might do if you're in a studio and you're lighting someone for a portrait. You wouldn't typically flood the whole scene with light. That you could do that, but it's just not very interesting. What you might do, especially if you're trying to do something a little more dramatic, is you might be a lot more specific with the placement of the light and the direction of the light, and you would do things, for example, like you might use split lighting, where you have the light coming in on one half of the person's face or their body, and in a similar way, you can look for situations where you can do that in a wildlife situation where the light is just coming in on one side. Another thing you can do, especially if you're photographing at night, and so now we're talking about using artificial light sources, not flashes or speed lights, because we don't want to do that to an animal, but where you're using a constant light source, you can shine it from below, so that you're not trying to light the whole animal, you're really trying to do less. So what you might do is you're just trying to get the outline of the animal and do something that's a little more subtle. So look for these kinds of opportunities where the light is doing something interesting, where it's broken up, where there's some directionality to it. And although we often try to avoid these harsh light situations because the shadows are really strong, sometimes when the placement of the light and the direction of the light works for us, then we can often deal with that harsh light, and in fact sometimes it's actually better. It makes the lighting more intense and the scene more intense. The second thing we want to look for is behavior. So what we're talking about here is where the animal is doing something interesting. Now that could be a lot of things. Sometimes it's walking or running or looking for food, or it could be hunting, or it could just be looking in a certain direction, perhaps at the camera or perhaps off the camera. There might be multiple subjects that are interacting. The subject might be interacting with you, the photographer. These are all things that we want to look for. If the subject is not doing anything that's interesting, if there's no interesting behavior in there, it really makes the image less impactful. So look for these opportunities when there is some interesting behavior going on, and especially if you can capture a behavior that is not often seen, that can be something that will really make an image more impactful. And when we're talking about impact, what we're really talking about is the idea that when someone views an image, that they will take time with that image. They won't just glance at it and then move on to something else, but there will be something that will capture their attention, and they will look at it and they will pause and they will consider it, and they might think about it and analyze it a little bit, and that draws them into the image, and it means that they're much more likely to become engaged in it. It means they're much more likely to perhaps want to buy it if it's a print, or share it with other people. The third thing we want to talk about is the scene. So I'm using the word S because we're often talking about the subject, and I think people are very overly focused on the subject. So one thing we can think about is it's not the subject, or it's not just the subject, it's the scene, the whole scene. And when we talk about the whole scene, what we really talking about often is the environment. That's the place where you have found the animal. And if we are getting in all the time and doing very tight shots, we don't get to see a lot of the environment. And if we're doing that, then those shots might as well have been taken at a zoo. Often, the environment is an interesting thing to incorporate into the image. Now, there are times when the environment is a distraction, and in those cases, perhaps we don't want as much of it in the image. But ideally, there are situations when the environment is actually beautiful, and in fact, there are times when the environment is overwhelmingly interesting. What I mean by that is that when you look at the environment and you go to take a photo of the animal in that environment, the environment is so interesting that you can't crop it out, that you really want to include it. One thing that's really cool, if you shoot in places like Africa, where they have some incredible trees, such as the baobab trees, and those trees are huge, and they really grab your attention, and the trees are so big that they dwarf even an elephant or a giraffe. And when you see an animal next to one of these trees, you can't possibly crop the tree out because it's just so much a part of the scene. And that's really interesting. It causes you to compose in a different kind of a way. So looking for these opportunities where the environment is something that's interesting and that you want to incorporate into an image, it can be really exciting. Another thing that can work really well is when you have water, especially if there are reflections that are happening, and if the environment is really interesting, and then you have the environment in the image, and then you also have a reflection of the environment in the image as well. The fourth thing we want to talk about and that we want to look for is story. So again, it's another word that begins with S. It's not just about the subject, it's about the story. What kind of a story do you want to tell with your image? Now, sometimes you can tell that story with one image. Sometimes it will take more than one image. And if you have more than one image, it might be a series of images that are quite similar, but at different points in time, so that you show some different events happening. Or they might be completely different types of images. So you might have some tight shots where you're showing sort of portraits. You might have some shots that are wider environment shots where you're giving the viewer a sense of the location. You might have some super tight shots showing attention to detail, such as zeroing right in and zooming right in on something like, the talons of an eagle's foot, or coming right in on the eye, or seeing some very, very close detail on the face that you might not otherwise normally be able to see. You can do it just because you have a long lens, and that really can bring the viewer in and show them something special. So what is the story that you want to tell? And sometimes that story can be really obviously told through the image or images. Sometimes it's more something that is implied. You can have, for example, let's say you have an animal that is looking off the camera, out of the frame. That brings all kinds of questions up in the viewer's mind. What is the animal looking at? So there is a story that you could tell with that, possibly with other images, or perhaps with some text that goes along with the image, or perhaps you just leave it untold, and the question arises in the viewer's mind, and that makes it more interesting. And the fifth and final thing that is really worth thinking about, and it's probably one of the hardest things to figure out with wildlife photography, is emotion. And that is, how do you want a viewer of an image to feel? One of the feelings that you can evoke is a feeling of intimacy, especially when you are able to get down into the world of an animal and get a shot that shows a connection, possibly between you, the photographer, and the animal. The person who is viewing that photo will share that connection as well, and it's a special feeling of seeing something special, of being in a place that they might not otherwise ever be able to be in. Perhaps you want the viewer to feel a sense of frustration or anger, or you want them to get upset because perhaps you're showing the animal in distress, in a situation that is not good, perhaps because of something that's happening in the environment. And then, as I mentioned before, there's also a very interesting feeling that can come about when things are not explicitly stated, when there are questions that arise, and there is this feeling of wondering, of questioning. So, for example, you might take a photo, and what might pop to the viewer's mind is, well, what happened after the photo, right? There's this question that arises. When you are taking these photos, and when you're reviewing your photos, if these emotions if there are emotions that you feel, it's quite likely that viewers will also experience those same emotions. So we've talked about 5 things. We've talked about light, we've talked about behavior, we've talked about the scene or the environment, we've talked about story, and then we've talked about emotion. Now, it's very hard to have all of these elements in one image, but the more of them that you can have, depending on the degree to which the degree to which they're present, can really make an image more impactful. If you don't have any of these things, if you don't have any interesting light, if you don't have any interesting behavior, if the environment is not interesting, if you don't have any kind of sense of story or any emotion that is felt out of the image, it's probably not going to be an impactful image. It's just going to be as I said in the beginning, a record shot or a proof shot or an evidence shot that just shows an animal in a place, and that you were there and you took a photo of the animal. We really want to go beyond that as much as possible. Now, of course, there are times when we take record shots. Sometimes we take them just for our own memories. Sometimes there are record shots that we take and we will share them with others just to show what was happening behind the scenes. But we don't want to come back from an outing to photograph wildlife when all we have, or most of what we have, is record shots. It's far better to think about some of these things that I've talked about and come back with 1 or 2 really impactful shots that have some of these elements in them, as opposed to many record shots and none of them being interesting at all. So I hope you have found this video interesting and helpful. I would love to hear your thoughts on some of these things that we've talked about, and whether or not you're able to incorporate them in your wildlife photography, whether you find it hard to do that, or if there are any particular tips that you might have in mind. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post down below. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.